Bullies pulled her top at recess. They didn't know she could snap arms. Cassidy Thorne kept her head down as she navigated the crowded hallways of Jefferson Ridge High School, clutching her worn textbooks against her chest like a shield. Her slight frame and oversized glasses made her nearly invisible among the sea of students rushing to their next classes. At barely 5'2", with mousy brown hair that perpetually fell across her face, she had perfected the art of blending into the background. Most students at Jefferson Ridge didn't even know her name, despite her having attended the school for nearly 2 years now. The red brick buildings of Jefferson Ridge High sprawled across 20 acres in suburban Colorado, housing over 2,000 students. Its reputation for academic excellence was matched only by its notorious social hierarchy, where popularity ruled supreme and anyone different was fair game for ridicule. Cassidy had learned this lesson the hard way during her first week, when she had dared to answer a question correctly in AP chemistry, only to be labeled a try-hard nerd by the popular crowd. She moved through the corridors with practiced precision, avoiding the main gathering spots where trouble typically brewed. The central courtyard where the athletes held court, the senior hallway lined with trophy cases, and especially the cafeteria during lunch periods were all landmines in her carefully mapped daily routine. But sometimes, despite her best efforts, trouble found her anyway. Well, look what crawled out of the science lab," came a familiar voice that made Cassidy's stomach drop. Brandon Kellerman stepped directly into her path, his 6-foot frame blocking her route to the library. With his perfectly styled blonde hair and varsity football jacket, he embodied everything Jefferson Ridge valued. His cruel smile revealed teeth whitened to an unnatural gleam, and his blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone who enjoyed wielding power over others. Flanking him were his usual accomplices, Trevor Nichols, a stocky wrestler whose neck seemed to merge directly with his shoulders, and Madison Pierce, whose perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the mean streak that ran through her like a fault line. Together, they formed Jefferson Ridge's most feared triumvirate, ruling their domain through intimidation and social manipulation. "Please, I just want to get to the library," Cassidy whispered, her voice barely audible above the hallway chatter. She tried to step around Brandon, but he smoothly blocked her path again, clearly enjoying the game. "The library?" "What a surprise," Madison laughed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Let me guess, you're going to study some more. Don't you ever do anything fun like normal people?" Trevor cracked his knuckles with an audible pop. "Maybe we should help her have some fun for once. What do you think, Brandon?" Cassidy felt her heart racing, but she forced herself to remain calm. Her father's voice echoed in her memory from countless training sessions. Control your breathing, control your mind, control the situation. She had been studying Krav Maga and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu since she was 8 years old, training religiously at her father's dojo downtown. Her father, a former military instructor, had taught her that true strength came from discipline and knowing when not to fight, not from proving your dominance over others. "I don't want any trouble," she said quietly, taking a small step backward. The irony wasn't lost on her that she could probably disable all 3 of them within 30 seconds, but revealing her abilities would only create bigger problems. Her father had drilled into her the importance of avoiding unnecessary confrontation, and she had promised him she would only use her training in genuine emergencies. Trouble. Who said anything about trouble? Brandon's grin widened as more students began to gather, sensing entertainment. "We're just being friendly, right, guys?" The crowd that had formed around them was a mixture of curious onlookers and silent enablers. Some students pulled out their phones, hoping to capture whatever humiliation was about to unfold. Others simply watched with the detached interest of people observing an accident on the highway. Mrs. Henderson, Cassidy's English teacher, walked past the growing commotion, but seemed determinedly oblivious to what was happening. just like most of the faculty who had learned to turn a blind eye to avoid complications. "Maybe you should smile more," Madison suggested with fake sweetness. "You always look so serious and weird. It's depressing to look at you." The comments continued as Cassidy stood frozen, calculating her options. She could fight back and win, but then she would become a target for every tough guy in school who wanted to test themselves against her. She could report them, but that would only make things worse when the administration inevitably failed to take meaningful action. Or she could endure it, as she had been doing for months, hoping they would eventually get bored and move on to easier prey. "Look at her just standing there," Trevor jeered. "I don't think she's even listening to us. Are you stupid or just rude?" The encounter ended when the bell rang, scattering students to their next classes. Brandon gave her a mocking bow before sauntering away with his friends, leaving Cassidy standing alone in the rapidly emptying hallway. She waited until her hands stopped shaking before making her way to the library, where she spent the rest of lunch period trying to focus on her homework while replaying the humiliation in her mind. This pattern continued for weeks. They would corner her in the hallways, make loud comments about her appearance when she walked past their table in the cafeteria, or accidentally bump into her hard enough to send her books scattering across the floor. Each incident was carefully calculated to stay just below the threshold that would prompt teacher intervention, but collectively they created a constant atmosphere of dread that followed Cassidy through her days. The situation escalated during a particularly brutal encounter in the gymnasium. Cassidy had been trying to retrieve her forgotten water bottle from her locker when she found herself alone with the trio. The gym was empty, except for some equipment stacked in the corners, and the isolation seemed to embolden them. "You know what your problem is," Brandon said, leaning casually against the lockers. "You think you're better than everyone else, walking around here like you're so smart, like the rest of us are beneath you." "That's not true," Cassidy protested, but her voice came out weak and unconvincing. "It's not true." Madison stepped closer, her designer sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. "Then why don't you ever talk to anyone? Why do you always act like you're too good to be social?" The accusations stung because they contained a grain of truth. Cassidy did keep to herself, but not out of arrogance. Her father had taught her to be observant, to watch and listen before acting, and years of training had made her naturally analytical. She saw through the superficial social games that seemed to consume her classmates, but that didn't mean she felt superior to them. "I'm just shy," she said honestly, which only seemed to anger them more. "Shy?" Trevor laughed harshly. "You're not shy, you're stuck up. There's a difference." They surrounded her then, not quite touching, but close enough that she could smell Trevor's excessive cologne and see the small scar on Madison's chin from some childhood accident. The proximity triggered every combat instinct her father had trained into her, but she forced herself to remain still. "Maybe we should help you come out of your shell," Brandon said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "What do you think, Madison? How do we make Little Miss Perfect here more social?" Before Cassidy could react, Trevor grabbed her backpack and dumped its contents across the floor. Her carefully organized notebooks scattered, pens rolled under the benches, and her graphing calculator skittered across the tiles until it hit the wall with a sharp crack. The hours of work represented in those scattered papers felt like pieces of herself being torn apart. "Oops," Trevor said with exaggerated innocence. "How clumsy of me." As Cassidy knelt to gather her belongings, fighting back tears of frustration and rage, she caught sight of someone entering the gymnasium. Daniel Reyes, a quiet student from her calculus class, had apparently come looking for something. Their eyes met across the distance, and she saw genuine concern in his expression. Unlike the usual crowd of gawkers who fed off drama like parasites, Daniel looked genuinely upset by what he was witnessing. "Hey, what's going on here?" Daniel called out, his voice echoing in the large space. Brandon turned toward the interruption with obvious annoyance. "Nothing that concerns you, Reyes. Keep walking." But Daniel didn't keep walking. Instead, he approached the group with the kind of quiet courage that Cassidy had rarely seen at Jefferson Ridge. Looks like Cassidy could use some help picking up her stuff. "I said it doesn't concern you," Brandon repeated, his tone becoming threatening. Daniel ignored the warning and knelt beside Cassidy, helping her gather the scattered papers. "You okay?" he asked quietly, and the genuine kindness in his voice nearly broke her resolve to stay calm. "I'm fine," she whispered, though they both knew it wasn't true. The bullies eventually left, but not before Brandon made sure to establish that Daniel had just painted a target on his own back. "Interesting choice, Reyes. Hope you don't regret it." Over the following days, Cassidy found herself paying more attention to Daniel. He was one of those students who existed in the gray area between social groups, smart enough to earn respect from the academic crowd, but athletic enough from his cross-country running to avoid being labeled a complete nerd. He had dark hair that always looked slightly messy, kind brown eyes, and a quiet confidence that drew her attention in ways she hadn't expected. Their friendship developed gradually through small moments shared in calculus class and brief conversations in the hallway. Daniel never pushed her to explain what had happened in the gymnasium, but his steady presence became a bright spot in her increasingly difficult days at Jefferson Ridge. She found herself looking forward to their interactions, and the growing warmth she felt toward him made her realize how isolated she had become. Unfortunately, Brandon and his friends quickly noticed the connection between them. What had started as targeting Cassidy alone evolved into a campaign designed to hurt her through Daniel as well. They began including him in their verbal attacks, making comments about the nerd couple, and suggesting that two losers deserved each other. The psychological pressure built steadily as autumn turned to winter. Every day brought new humiliations, from crude drawings left on Cassidy's locker to spreading rumors about both her and Daniel that made them objects of mockery throughout the school. The constant stress affected her grades, her sleep, and her ability to concentrate during her martial arts training. Her father noticed the change during one of their evening sessions at the dojo. "Your form is sloppy tonight," he observed, after she failed to execute a basic combination correctly for the third time. "Something's distracting you." Cassidy adjusted her GI and tried to focus, but her mind kept drifting to the encounter she had endured that afternoon when Madison had loudly speculated about her and Daniel's imaginary romantic activities within earshot of half the cafeteria. "It's nothing, Dad, just school stuff." "School stuff doesn't usually affect your training like this," he pressed gently. "Talk to me." But how could she explain without admitting that she was allowing herself to be victimized? Her father had raised her to be strong, had given her the tools to defend herself and others, and she was choosing not to use them. The shame of that realization made her feel even more trapped. "There are some students who like to cause problems," she said carefully, "but I'm handling it." Her father's expression grew serious. "Are you? Because handling a situation means resolving it, not just enduring it. There's a difference between avoiding unnecessary fights and allowing yourself to become someone's victim." His words stayed with her as she drove home that night, wrestling with the growing tension between her training and her current reality. She had spent years learning to defend herself and others, but when the moment came to apply those skills, she found herself paralyzed by the potential consequences. The breaking point came on a cold December morning during the outdoor lunch period. Jefferson Ridge had a tradition of allowing students to eat outside when weather permitted, and despite the chilly air, many students preferred the freedom of the courtyard to the oppressive atmosphere of the cafeteria. Cassidy and Daniel had found a quiet spot near the science building where they could eat and study without attracting attention. They were reviewing calculus problems together, their breath visible in the cold air, when Brandon and his crew approached with an energy that immediately set off Cassidy's danger instincts. There was something different about their demeanor today, a predatory excitement that suggested they had planned something special. "Well, well, if it isn't our favorite couple," Brandon announced loudly enough to attract the attention of nearby students. "Having a romantic lunch in the cold? How sweet." "Just leave us alone," Daniel said, standing up and positioning himself slightly in front of Cassidy. The protective gesture was noble, but ultimately useless against what came next. "Leave you alone?" Madison laughed, the sound cutting through the cold air like breaking glass. "But we're just getting started. We've been talking, and we realized we've been too easy on you two. It's time for some real fun." What happened next unfolded with horrible clarity. Trevor moved behind Daniel, while Brandon approached from the front, creating a pincer movement that left him nowhere to retreat. Madison focused on Cassidy with the kind of calculated cruelty that only teenage girls seemed capable of perfecting. "You know what I think," Madison said, circling Cassidy like a predator. "I think you've been playing innocent this whole time. But you're probably just as attention-seeking as every other girl in school. You just hide it better." The crowd that had gathered was larger than usual, drawn by the promise of entertainment and the escalating tension. Some students held up phones, ready to capture whatever humiliation was about to unfold for social media posterity. Others simply watched with the kind of morbid fascination people reserved for car accidents and public meltdowns. "Leave her alone," Daniel said again, but his voice cracked slightly under the pressure of being outnumbered and surrounded. "Or what?" Brandon shoved him hard enough to send him stumbling backward into Trevor's waiting arms. "You'll do what exactly? Fight us? I don't think so." The physical escalation drew even more attention as students formed a loose circle around the confrontation. Teachers were noticeably absent, probably enjoying their lunch in the warmth of the faculty lounge while their students played out Lord of the Flies in the courtyard. "I bet she's not as innocent as she pretends to be," Madison continued, her voice getting louder for the benefit of their audience. "I bet underneath that shy little act, she's just like every other attention seeker in school." Without warning, Madison lunged forward and grabbed the front of Cassidy's sweater, yanking hard enough to stretch the fabric. The sudden violence of the action sent shockwaves through the watching crowd, and several students gasped audibly. "Stop it!" Cassidy said, grabbing Madison's wrist, but the other girl was stronger than she looked and fueled by the adrenaline of having an audience. "What's under here anyway?" Madison taunted, pulling harder at the sweater. "Let's see what you're so desperate to hide." The fabric began to give way under the sustained pressure, and Cassidy felt a cold rush of air against her skin as the neckline stretched beyond its breaking point. The humiliation was complete when Madison gave one final vicious yank that tore the sweater completely, leaving Cassidy standing in the cold courtyard in just her thin undershirt while her ruined sweater hung in tatters from Madison's grip. The crowd erupted in a mixture of shocked gasps, nervous laughter, and excited chatter as phones captured every moment of Cassidy's degradation. She stood frozen for a moment, her arms instinctively crossing over her chest while her mind struggled to process what had just happened. But then something inside her snapped. All the months of accumulated humiliation, the constant fear, the sleepless nights, wondering what fresh torment awaited her each day, crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. She thought of her father's teachings, of years spent learning to defend herself and others, of the promise she had made to only use her skills when absolutely necessary. This was absolutely necessary. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The shy, frightened girl who had been standing there seconds before seemed to evaporate, replaced by someone completely different. Cassidy's posture straightened, her breathing became controlled and purposeful, and her eyes took on the focused intensity that her father had trained into her through thousands of hours of practice. Madison was still holding the torn sweater, laughing at her own cleverness, when Cassidy moved. The first technique was a simple wrist lock that her father had taught her when she was 10 years old. She grabbed Madison's extended wrist with both hands, applied pressure to specific nerve points, and twisted with precise leverage that forced the other girl to release the sweater and drop to one knee with a cry of pain and surprise. "What the hell?" Madison gasped, confusion replacing her earlier confidence. But Cassidy wasn't finished. Years of suppressed anger and frustration channeled through techniques that had been drilled into her muscle memory until they became instinct. She released the wrist lock only to immediately apply a standing armbar that hyperextended Madison's elbow just enough to cause serious discomfort without permanent damage. "Stop, you're hurting me," Madison pleaded, her voice rising to a near shriek that cut through the crowd's excited murmur. The watching students fell silent as they witnessed something unprecedented. The quiet girl they had watched get bullied for months was systematically dismantling one of Jefferson Ridge's most feared students with techniques that looked like something from an action movie. Brandon and Trevor rushed forward to help their friend, but they had no idea what they were walking into. Cassidy's father had prepared her for multiple attackers, and the confined space of the courtyard actually worked to her advantage by limiting their ability to surround her effectively. When Trevor reached for her, she ducked under his grab and swept his legs with a perfectly executed foot sweep that sent him crashing to the concrete with bone-jarring impact. Before he could recover, she applied a knee bar that immobilized his leg and elicited a scream of pain that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Brandon hesitated for just a moment as he processed what had happened to his two friends, and that hesitation was all Cassidy needed. She released Trevor and moved toward Brandon with fluid grace, slipping past his clumsy punches as if they were moving in slow motion. The combination she used on him was more complex, starting with a deflection of his wild swing, followed by a palm strike to his solar plexus that doubled him over, gasping for air. While he was bent forward and vulnerable, she applied a guillotine choke that cut off his air supply and forced him to his knees beside his defeated friends. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 90 seconds, but it felt like hours to the stunned crowd watching the impossible unfold before their eyes. The three most feared bullies in school were now kneeling on the cold concrete, nursing injuries and staring up at the girl they had tormented for months with expressions of shock and disbelief. Cassidy stood over them, breathing controlled and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Her father's training had prepared her for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the intoxicating rush of finally fighting back after months of forced submission. "Please," Brandon gasped, still struggling to catch his breath from the choke. "We're sorry. We didn't know." "Didn't know what?" Cassidy asked quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "That I was a person who deserved basic respect, that your actions have consequences, that picking on someone smaller than you doesn't make you strong." The crowd remained frozen, phones still recording, but no longer focused on her humiliation. Instead, they were capturing the moment when Jefferson Ridge's social hierarchy cracked and shifted beneath their feet. Daniel had recovered from his earlier shock and moved to stand beside her, offering his jacket to cover her torn clothing. The gesture was protective and supportive without being possessive, and Cassidy felt a warm rush of gratitude toward him that made her realize how much his friendship had come to mean to her. "I trained in martial arts for 10 years, she announced to the watching crowd, her voice steady and clear. "My father taught me that strength isn't about hurting people who can't fight back. It's about protecting yourself and others when necessary. It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away." She looked down at the three bullies still kneeling before her, and for a moment she felt the temptation to hurt them more, to make them pay for every moment of fear and humiliation they had put her through. The power was intoxicating, and she understood in that instant how easy it would be to become exactly what she hated. But her father's teachings ran deeper than technique and physical ability. He had taught her discipline, restraint, and the crucial difference between justice and revenge. "I could hurt you much worse than this," she said quietly, speaking directly to Brandon. "I could break bones, cause permanent damage, make you feel as helpless and afraid as you made me feel every day. But I won't, because that would make me just like you." She stepped back, creating distance between herself and her defeated tormentors. "This ends here. You leave me alone, you leave Daniel alone, and you find someone else to be. Someone better." The crowd began to disperse slowly, students whispering excitedly among themselves as they processed what they had witnessed. Several approached Cassidy to offer congratulations or support, including some who had stood by silently during months of bullying and were now eager to associate themselves with her victory. Mrs. Patterson, the vice principal, finally arrived on the scene just as the confrontation was ending. She took in the sight of three students nursing injuries and immediately began demanding explanations. But the crowd of witnesses was unanimously supportive of Cassidy's version of events. "They attacked her first," one student testified. "Madison ripped her shirt off right in front of everyone." "She was just defending herself," another added. "They've been picking on her all year." Even some of the students who had previously ignored the bullying stepped forward to provide testimony, perhaps motivated by guilt over their earlier inaction, or simply by the desire to be on the winning side of a dramatically shifted power dynamic. The disciplinary hearing that followed was surprisingly brief. The school's zero-tolerance policy technically applied to all physical altercations, but the overwhelming evidence of self-defense, combined with multiple witness testimonies about months of prior bullying, left the administration with little choice but to treat Cassidy as the victim rather than the aggressor. Brandon, Madison, and Trevor received suspensions and were required to attend anger management counseling. More importantly, word of their humiliating defeat spread throughout Jefferson Ridge faster than wildfire, effectively ending their reign of terror over their fellow students. The transformation in how other students treated Cassidy was immediate and dramatic. Where once she had been invisible or actively avoided, she now found herself surrounded by people eager to talk to her, to associate with her, to bask in the reflected glory of her dramatic victory. Some of the attention made her uncomfortable, particularly from students who seemed more interested in her fighting ability than in her as a person. But there were also genuine connections, friendships that developed with people who respected her for standing up for herself and others. Her relationship with Daniel deepened as well, evolving from friendship into something more meaningful as they spent more time together without the constant shadow of bullying hanging over them. Their first real conversation about what had happened occurred the following weekend at the dojo, where Cassidy had invited him to watch one of her training sessions. "I can't believe you've been dealing with all of that while keeping this secret," Daniel said as they sat in the dojo's small cafe after her training session. "Why didn't you fight back sooner?" "Because fighting should be the last resort, not the first," she replied, echoing her father's teachings. "I hoped they would get bored and move on. I hoped I could find another way to solve the problem." "And now?" Cassidy considered the question carefully. "Now I know that sometimes people only understand strength. But I also know that strength without restraint is just bullying in a different form." Her father joined them at the table, still wearing his instructor's GI and radiating the calm confidence that had shaped Cassidy's approach to martial arts. "I'm proud of how you handled the situation," he told her. "Not just the physical confrontation, but the restraint you showed afterward. It would have been easy to let anger drive your actions. I wanted to hurt them more, she admitted. In that moment, I understood why people become bullies. The power feels good. That understanding will make you stronger, her father replied. Not physically, but mentally and morally. The real test of character isn't whether you can defeat someone weaker than you. It's whether you can show mercy when you have the power to cause harm. The weeks following the confrontation brought a strange new reality to Jefferson Ridge. The incident had sparked conversations about bullying, bystander responsibility, and the toxic social hierarchies that had been allowed to flourish unchecked. Some students began standing up to bullies they had previously feared, inspired by Cassidy's example. Brandon and his friends returned from their suspensions noticeably changed. The arrogant confidence that had once defined them was replaced by wariness and genuine humility. They avoided Cassidy entirely, but more importantly, they seemed to have lost their appetite for targeting other vulnerable students. The most significant change came during a school assembly in late January, when Brandon approached Cassidy after the presentation about conflict resolution. Most of the students had already left for their next classes, leaving the auditorium nearly empty except for a few stragglers. "Cassidy," he said quietly, his voice lacking any trace of his former cockiness, "can I talk to you for a minute?" She looked at him warily. Daniel standing protectively nearby, but nodded for him to continue. "I wanted to apologize," Brandon said, the words coming slowly, as if they were difficult to form. "Not just for that day in the courtyard, but for everything, for months of making your life miserable for no reason except that I could." Cassidy studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but saw only genuine remorse and shame. "I don't know why I did it," he continued. "Maybe because picking on you made me feel powerful, or because everyone expected me to act like that, or because I was dealing with my own problems and taking them out on someone who couldn't fight back. None of those are excuses, just explanations." "Thank you for saying that," Cassidy replied carefully. "But apologies don't undo the damage that was done." "I know. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did was wrong, and that I'm trying to be better. I've been talking to the school counselor, and I'm learning about the impact that bullying has on people. I never really thought about it before." The conversation was awkward and tentative, but it represented something important. Not forgiveness necessarily, but acknowledgement and the possibility of growth and change. As spring arrived at Jefferson Ridge, Cassidy found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed. The shy, frightened girl who had started the school year seemed like a different person, replaced by someone confident and respected, but not feared. She had learned to balance her natural reserve with the ability to stand up for herself and others when necessary. Her relationship with Daniel had blossomed into something beautiful and genuine, built on mutual respect and shared experiences rather than trauma bonding. They studied together, trained together at the dojo, and spent long conversations talking about their plans for college and beyond. Most importantly, she had discovered that true strength wasn't about the ability to defeat others in combat, but about the wisdom to know when to fight and when to show mercy. Her father's teachings had given her the tools to defend herself, but her own moral compass had prevented her from becoming the very thing she had fought against. The story of her confrontation with the bullies had become something of a legend at Jefferson Ridge, growing in the telling until some versions bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. But for Cassidy, the most important outcome wasn't the reputation or the respect she had gained, but the knowledge that she could face whatever challenges life presented with courage and integrity. On a warm afternoon in May, as she sat in the courtyard where her transformation had begun, she watched new students navigating the complex social dynamics of high school. Some looked lost and frightened, just as she had been. And she made a mental note to reach out to them, to let them know they weren't alone. Her journey from victim to victor had taught her that everyone deserves respect and dignity, regardless of their social status or perceived weaknesses. It had shown her that standing up for yourself doesn't require becoming cruel to others, and that true strength comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. The bullies who had once tormented her had learned that actions have consequences, but more importantly, they had learned that there was another way to be. The bystanders who had once remained silent had learned that their inaction made them complicit in others' suffering, and many had found the courage to speak up when they witnessed injustice. As for Cassidy herself, she had learned that sometimes the greatest victory isn't in defeating your enemies, but in helping them become better people. The shy girl who had once cowered in fear had become a leader and protector, not through violence and intimidation, but through courage, restraint, and the understanding that true strength lies not in the ability to cause harm, but in the wisdom to choose not to.